A manager fired a loyal dishwasher after 25 years of service, thinking corporate would never notice. But when a new dishwasher started asking questions, she mocked him openly. Nobody important will ever care about a dishwasher. What she didn't know was that she was speaking to the CEO himself. Here's the full story. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another powerful undercover story that reveals the hidden realities behind the institutions we trust. You won't want to miss it. Alexander Mercer stood at the window of his corner office, gazing out at the Seattle skyline. 20 stories below, he could just make out the glimmering waterfront where his flagship restaurant, Harbor Bistro, had stood for 3 decades. At 58, Alexander had achieved everything his father had dreamed of when they opened that first location, a seafood restaurant empire spanning 20 locations across the Pacific Northwest, each one known for exceptional quality and service. The morning sun glinted off his numerous industry awards, lining the polished shelves. Each crystal trophy represented a milestone in building Harbor Bistro from a humble family restaurant into a regional powerhouse. But lately, something felt off. The pride Alexander once took in these accolades had been replaced by a nagging sense of disconnect. "Your 9 o'clock is here, Mr. Mercer," his assistant's voice chimed through the intercom. The quarterly board meeting proceeded like clockwork until Monica Chen, his chief operations officer, took the floor. "We need to address some concerning trends," Monica said, her normally confident voice hesitant. "Customer satisfaction at our original location has dropped 15% over the last 2 quarters. "That's impossible," Alexander interjected. "The flagship is our crown jewel." Monica slid a folder across the table, and its staff turnover is up 30% year over year, primarily among veteran employees. Reviews mention declining service quality and food inconsistency. "What are our managers saying?" "Patricia Yates insists everything is fine, just growing pains as they modernize operations. She's implemented several cost-cutting measures that have improved margins." Later that afternoon, Alexander received an email that made his heart skip. What happened to Harbor Bistro's soul? The message was from a former employee. "Mr. Mercer, I worked at your flagship location for 7 years until last month. I don't know if you're aware of what's happening there, but it's not the place your father built. Longtime employees are being pushed out, corners are being cut, and anyone who speaks up disappears. Last week, they fired Thomas, the dishwasher who's been there since day one, the man who practically raised you in that kitchen. He gave 25 years to Harbor Bistro and was discarded like yesterday's catch. Your father would be ashamed." Alexander's blood ran cold. Thomas Jefferson had indeed been there from the beginning. A constant presence in the steamy back kitchens, where a young Alexander had learned the business from the ground up. He navigated to the company's HR system and searched for Thomas Jefferson's file. There it was. Employment terminated 3 weeks ago. Reason: position elimination due to operational restructuring. After 25 years of service, Thomas had received the minimum severance package required by law. Alexander slumped back in his chair, a mixture of guilt and anger welling inside him. When was the last time he'd actually visited the flagship restaurant as more than just a passing courtesy? He needed to understand what was really happening at Harbor Bistro, not as Alexander Mercer, CEO, who would be shown a carefully curated version of operations, but as someone who could see the unfiltered truth. "You want to do what?" Monica stared at Alexander across his desk, her expression caught between confusion and concern. "I need to see for myself what's happening at the flagship," Alexander repeated calmly. "Not as the CEO, but as a regular employee. We have systems for this. We can arrange focus groups, employee surveys, and every one of those can be manipulated," he cut in. "Thomas wasn't just an employee. He was there when my father and I were scrubbing pots ourselves to make payroll. He stayed late every Christmas Eve so my family could celebrate together." "What do you plan to do?" "I'm taking a leave of absence. The board will be told I'm exploring international expansion opportunities. You'll handle day-to-day operations. Meanwhile, I'll apply for a position at the flagship." That evening, Alexander stood in his bathroom, staring at his reflection. His silver hair and designer glasses had become his trademark. He picked up the box of hair dye he'd purchased, a nondescript brown. 30 minutes later, he rinsed away decades of distinguished gray. Next came the contacts to replace his distinctive frames, followed by a trip to a department store for clothes no one would expect Alexander Mercer to wear. The final touch was 3 days of stubble growth. By the weekend, Alexander Mercer had vanished, replaced by Alex Mitchell, an out-of-work chef looking for any position. Before submitting his application, Alexander sat in his car outside Thomas's apartment building in Rainier Valley. The neighborhood was a far cry from Alexander's waterfront penthouse. He spotted a familiar figure walking slowly up the street. Thomas Jefferson looked older than Alexander remembered, his once straight shoulders now slightly hunched. He carried grocery bags that seemed to weigh him down more than they should. The next morning, Alex Mitchell walked into the restaurant's employee entrance, resume in hand. The kitchen was already humming with morning prep, but something felt different from Alexander's memories. The energy was frantic rather than focused. The staff silent rather than collaborative. Patricia Yates didn't look up from her computer as Alexander entered her office. At 42, she was the model of efficiency, tailored clothes, immaculate hair, and a desk so organized it barely looked used. "I'm here about a position," Alexander said, adopting a slightly hesitant tone. "We're not hiring servers right now." She still hadn't looked up. "I'll take anything. Dishwasher, prep cook, busser." This finally earned him eye contact. Patricia assessed him coolly. "You're overqualified. Your resume says you were an executive chef." "I was. Restaurant closed. I've got bills to pay and I'm not too proud to wash dishes." Something calculating flickered across Patricia's face. "We did just lose a dishwasher. When can you start?" "Immediately." "Fine. $15 an hour. No benefits for the first 90 days. You'll work the closing shift, 4 p.m. to midnight. Report to Devin, the night manager." Steam billowed as Alexander plunged his hands into scalding water, scrubbing furiously at a burnt pot. 6 hours into his first shift, his back ached, his fingers were pruned, and the mountain of dishes seemed never ending. The dish station was tucked in the farthest corner of the kitchen, a forgotten outpost with poor lighting, a cracked floor, and a constant puddle from the leaking dishwasher. Alexander remembered when this area had been just as well maintained as the rest of the kitchen. His father had insisted that every part of the restaurant receive equal attention, believing that neglect in one area inevitably spread to others. The kitchen itself had changed too. Gone were the cheerful calls between stations, the playful banter that had once made busy shifts manageable. Instead, line cooks worked in tense silence, communication reduced to clipped, necessary instructions. The gleaming copper pots his father had proudly displayed now showed tarnish from hasty cleaning. Even the menu had changed, portions smaller, garnishes simpler, presentation less artistic. These weren't the inevitable changes of time, but deliberate sacrifices of quality for expediency. "You keeping up back there, new guy?" Devin, the night manager, appeared beside the dish pit. At 35, he had the sharp assessing eyes of someone always looking for inefficiencies. "Managing," Alexander grunted, lifting a rack of gleaming wine glasses. Devin glanced at his watch. "Pick up the pace. We close in 2 hours and Chef needs these pans for the final push." As Devin walked away, Alexander noticed him stopping to chat with a group of younger servers, laughing easily. The contrast with his brusque treatment of the kitchen staff was striking. "Don't take it personally," said a voice behind him. A woman in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled into a practical bun, was stacking plates nearby. "I'm Sophia, been serving here for 11 years. "Alex," he replied, wincing as hot water splashed his wrist. "Is it always this busy?" "On weekends, yes. Used to be we had 2 dishwashers per shift. Sometimes 3 during peak hours. Thomas could handle it alone, because he knew all the shortcuts, but it's not really a one-person job." Alexander's ears perked up. "Thomas?" "He was here forever. Started with the original owner." Sophia's eyes clouded. "They let him go last month. After all those years, not even a proper goodbye." "That seems harsh." Sophia looked around cautiously. "Devin's been pushing out the older staff since he arrived. Says we're operationally inefficient. Translate: too expensive and not afraid to speak up. She leaned closer, lowering her voice further. Last month, Maria from Pastry asked for time off for her daughter's graduation. Devin scheduled her for 6 straight closing shifts as punishment. When Carlos from the bar complained about broken glassware cutting his hand, Patricia wrote him up for damaging company property. And when Jenny from Host Stand, who'd been here 8 years, requested her promised raise, they suddenly discovered performance issues no one had mentioned before. Sophia's eyes darted toward the manager's office. They've developed this system. They cut your hours just enough that you can't pay bills, but not enough to qualify for unemployment. They assign impossible side work, then document when you can't finish. They schedule you for shifts you've clearly marked as unavailable, then write you up when you can't make it. Eventually, people either quit or get fired with cause. Either way, Harbor Bistro doesn't have to pay unemployment. By midnight, Alexander's designer hands were raw despite the rubber gloves. As the rest of the staff filtered out, he found himself alone with Devin, who was counting the night's receipts. "You didn't do bad for your first night," Devin remarked, not looking up, "though Thomas would have finished an hour ago." Alexander carefully kept his tone neutral. "I heard he worked here a long time." "Too long. Got comfortable, slow. Restaurants can't afford deadweight these days." Alexander bit his tongue. "The equipment seems a bit outdated." Devin snorted. "Corporate's too cheap to replace anything that still technically works. This place is a cash cow for them. They milk it while putting minimal back in." Throughout his next shift, Alexander observed the stark division between newer and veteran employees. Younger staff received better sections, more flexible schedules, and lighter side work. Meanwhile, long-term employees were saddled with the worst shifts and most demanding tasks. He was heading back to the kitchen when he overheard Patricia speaking to Devin in the narrow hallway. "Corporate's thrilled with the Q2 numbers," Patricia was saying. "Labor costs down 18% year over year." "Told you my strategy would work," Devin replied smugly. "Target the expensive veterans, cut hours just enough so they leave voluntarily. No unemployment costs, no messy terminations." "Except Thomas," Patricia remarked. He refused to take the hint. "He was becoming a liability anyway." Devin lowered his voice. "Started documenting the safety issues after he hurt his back on that broken floor tile. We couldn't risk him filing a workers' comp claim." Alexander froze, anger pulsing behind his eyes. They'd fired Thomas for reporting safety concerns that were legitimate and potentially dangerous to all staff. Later that night, Sophia found Alexander scrubbing ferociously at an already clean pot. "You look like you're trying to murder that cookware," she observed. Alexander realized his anger was showing. "Just thorough," he replied, then hesitated. "Sophia, what exactly happened to Thomas? Why was he really let go?" Sophia's eyes darted around before she stepped closer. "He slipped on a broken tile by the prep station. His back was never the same. He asked for repairs multiple times, documented everything. Next thing we knew, Patricia was escorting him out, claiming his position had been eliminated." "That's illegal," Alexander said, forgetting to maintain his cover. "Of course it is," Sophia agreed bitterly. "But who's going to fight it? Thomas didn't have the money for a lawyer, and the rest of us, we just keep our heads down and hope we're not next." On his 4th night at Harbor Bistro, Alexander volunteered to stay late and finish closing. Devin, eager to leave early for a date, readily agreed. Once alone, Alexander moved quickly toward the manager's office, finding Thomas Jefferson's personnel file thick with nearly 3 decades of documentation. Inside were years of exemplary performance reviews, punctuated by recent performance improvement plans initiated shortly after the Devin's arrival. A separate folder that labeled incident reports contained multiple safety concerns reported by Thomas: broken floor tiles, malfunctioning equipment, even electrical hazards. Each report had been acknowledged but marked low priority, no budget allocated. The final entry was a workers' compensation claim from Thomas after his fall, which had been denied by Patricia with a note: "Employee at fault, didn't follow safety protocols." Finding anything interesting? Alexander whirled around to find Devin, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. I was looking for next week's schedule, Alexander lied smoothly. Devon's lips curled into a knowing smirk. In the personnel files? Try again. Alexander considered maintaining his cover, then decided against it. Fine. I wanted to know what happened to Thomas. Curiosity's a dangerous quality in a dishwasher, Devon replied, stepping into the office. But since you asked, Thomas became a problem. Always complaining about equipment, scheduling, benefits. We can't afford to coddle employees who don't contribute to the bottom line. He worked here for 25 years, Alexander countered, unable to hide his disgust. Exactly. 25 years of salary increases, accrued vacation, health insurance costs. Do you know what I could hire for his salary? 2 line cooks fresh from culinary school. Younger, faster, cheaper, and they don't know enough to question management decisions. Devon leaned forward. That's business, Alex. Harbor Bistro isn't a charity. It's a profit center for corporate shareholders who couldn't care less about some dishwasher's loyalty. What shareholders? Alexander asked carefully. Harbor Bistro is privately owned. Devon chuckled. The CEO's never here. Mercer's too busy expanding to notice what happens at the flagship, as long as profit margins keep improving. The next day, Alexander called in sick. Instead of reporting to Harbor Bistro, he drove to Thomas Jefferson's apartment complex. Mr. Mercer? Thomas asked uncertainly, staring at Alexander's dyed hair and casual clothes. Hello, Thomas, Alexander replied, emotion tightening his throat. May I come in? Thomas's modest apartment was meticulously clean but sparse. A small table was covered with job applications, a framed photo of the original Harbor Bistro staff, including Alexander and his father. Hung on the wall, Alexander explained his undercover investigation, watching Thomas's expression shift from surprise to resignation. So you finally noticed something was wrong, Thomas said, without accusation. I should have noticed sooner, Alexander admitted. Thomas, I'm sorry about what happened to you. I had no idea. Thomas sighed heavily. It started small. New management bringing in their own people. Then the cost cutting, cheaper ingredients, fewer staff, postponed maintenance. When I hurt my back, I thought surely someone would fix that broken tile before someone else got hurt. Instead, Patricia called me into her office and told me my position had been eliminated. After 25 years, Alexander whispered, I tried calling corporate, your office, left messages that never got returned. Eventually, I gave up. Thomas gestured to the applications. I'm working 2 part-time jobs now, neither with benefits. At my age, starting over isn't easy. Alexander's chest tightened with guilt. The Harbor Bistro I knew, that my father built, would never have let this happen. Your father understood something Patricia and Devon don't, Thomas said, meeting Alexander's gaze directly. A restaurant isn't just about food or profit. It's about people. The guests, yes, but also the staff. We were family once. Alexander arrived for his shift the following evening with renewed purpose. Sophia intercepted him before he reached the dish pit. Patricia's been asking questions about you, she whispered urgently. Devon told her you were snooping in personnel files. I'm not surprised, Alexander replied calmly. You don't understand, Sophia insisted. She's called an all-staff meeting at the end of service. I think they're going to fire you. Alexander nodded. Perfect. Patricia didn't waste time. Devon tells me you were accessing confidential employee records. Care to explain? I was curious about what happened to Thomas, Alexander replied simply. Patricia's eyes narrowed. And why would a dishwasher of less than a week be interested in a former employee? Because I care about how people are treated. Devon snorted. We've got a regular crusader here. Patricia studied Alexander carefully. Who are you really? You're clearly not just some out-of-work chef. You'll find out at the staff meeting, Alexander replied, holding her gaze steadily. At last, service ended. Patricia directed everyone to gather in the dining room. Tables had been pushed aside to create a makeshift meeting space. Thank you all for staying late, Patricia began, her voice crisp. I don't usually call full staff meetings, but a situation has arisen that concerns everyone. She gestured toward Alexander. This man was hired as a dishwasher last week. However, we have reason to believe he's not who he claims to be. Murmurs rippled through the assembled staff. Last night, he was caught accessing confidential personnel files, Patricia continued. When questioned, he was evasive and uncooperative. We believe he may be gathering information for a competitor or possibly a labor organization attempting to disrupt our operations. Mr. Mitchell, if that's even your name, Patricia said, turning to him, do you have anything to say before we terminate your employment and consider legal action? Alexander stepped forward, scanning the faces around him. My name isn't Alex Mitchell, he began, his voice clear and steady. Patricia's right about that. Devin smirked triumphantly. My name, Alexander continued, reaching up to remove his non-prescription glasses, is Alexander Mercer. I'm the CEO and owner of Harbor Bistro. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Patricia's face drained of color. Devin took an involuntary step backward. That's impossible, Patricia stammered. Mr. Mercer is standing right in front of you, Alexander finished, pulling his company ID from his pocket and holding it up. I've spent the past week working as a dishwasher in my own restaurant because I received disturbing reports about how it was being managed. What I discovered was worse than I imagined, Alexander continued, his voice hardening. Safety violations deliberately ignored. Long-term employees pushed out through manipulative scheduling and fabricated performance issues. Quality standards abandoned in pursuit of profit margins. Patricia found her voice. Mr. Mercer, I can explain. I've heard enough explanations in the files I accessed last night. What I want now is accountability. He turned to address the staff directly. Harbor Bistro was founded on the principle that every role matters. My father believed that a restaurant is only as good as how it treats its employees. Somewhere along the way, that vision was corrupted. Alexander pulled out his phone and pulled up photos he'd taken. Broken floor tiles that caused Thomas Jefferson's injury, faulty electrical wiring near the prep stations, understaffing that creates dangerous working conditions, all reported, all ignored. He turned to Devin. You told me, and I quote, nobody who matters is watching closely enough to care. Well, I'm watching now, and I care very much. Patricia Yates and Devin Lassiter, your employment with Harbor Bistro is terminated, effective immediately. Please gather your belongings and leave the premises. Patricia stepped forward, her professional demeanor crumbling. You can't do this. We've increased profits by 20%. The board will hear about this. The board works for me, not the other way around, Alexander interrupted, his voice level but firm. And Harbor Bistro was never meant to be just a profit machine. It was built to be a place where people matter, both customers and staff. Devin scoffed, his fear giving way to bitterness. Pretty words from a guy who's been absent for years. You abandoned this place. We just adapted to the reality of the restaurant business. Alexander met his gaze steadily. You're right about one thing. I was absent. That's on me. But what you did wasn't adaptation, it was exploitation. There's a difference between running a tight ship and running people into the ground. Patricia gathered her belongings, her face rigid with controlled fury. Devin followed, pausing at the door to offer one last parting shot. You'll be back to the same systems within a month. Nobody can run a successful restaurant chain without making these kinds of decisions. After they left, Alexander turned back to the stunned staff. I owe all of you an apology. I lost touch with what was happening in this restaurant, the restaurant where I learned every aspect of this business. That ends today. He sought out Sophia in the crowd. Sophia, I'm appointing you interim manager until a permanent replacement can be found. Your 11 years of service and dedication to our customers make you the right person for this role. Beginning tomorrow, we're conducting a full safety inspection and addressing every maintenance issue. All staff will have their hours and schedules reviewed to ensure fairness, and any employee who was terminated under questionable circumstances will be contacted and offered reinstatement with full restoration of benefits and seniority. A tentative hand raised from the back. Does that include Thomas? Asked a veteran line cook. Alexander smiled for the first time that evening. Thomas Jefferson was the heart of this kitchen for 25 years. His position was never eliminated. It was stolen from him. And yes, if he's willing, his job is waiting for him with full back pay and benefits. The following morning, Alexander arrived at Harbor Bistro before sunrise. A maintenance crew was already on site, addressing the most critical safety issues. New floor tiles were being installed, electrical systems updated, and the ancient dishwasher, which had been scalding workers for months, was being replaced. At 10, Alexander left the restaurant for Thomas Jefferson's apartment. "Mr. Mercer," Thomas said, his tone guarded, "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." "I came to offer you your job back," Alexander said without preamble, "with full restoration of benefits, seniority, and back pay for the weeks you've been gone." Thomas's expression remained cautious. "Why?" "Because firing you was wrong. Because you deserve better after 25 years of service. Because Harbor Bistro needs people like you who care about more than just the bottom line." Thomas studied him carefully. "And Patricia? Devin?" "Gone. Both of them as of last night." "The safety issues?" "Being fixed as we speak. New dishwasher, new floor tiles, electrical repairs. Everything you reported is being addressed immediately." Thomas was silent for a long moment, considering. Finally, he asked, "What happens when you go back to your office, Mr. Mercer? How do I know this isn't temporary?" "Because I'm not going back, not completely," Alexander replied. "Every executive, including myself, will work 1 week per quarter in one of our restaurants, not as managers, but alongside line staff. We've lost touch with what makes this business work. That ends now." Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Your father would approve." "I hope so," Alexander said quietly. "He built something special. I nearly let it be destroyed through neglect. I won't make that mistake again." After a moment, Thomas extended his hand. "I'll be there tomorrow morning. My station better be ready." Alexander clasped his hand firmly, emotion tightening his throat. "It will be. Thank you, Thomas." The next morning, Alexander arrived 2 hours early to personally inspect the renovations. The dish station had been completely transformed, new equipment installed, proper drainage fixed, ergonomic floor mats added to reduce strain. He'd ordered the best commercial dishwasher available, one that would protect hands from scalding water and reduce steam burns. The broken tiles throughout the kitchen had been replaced, electrical hazards fixed, and even the aging hood system upgraded. What had been the most neglected corner of the restaurant was now a proper workstation worthy of respect. At precisely 10 a.m., Thomas walked through the employee entrance. He moved cautiously, as though expecting to find the same disrespect that had marked his final days. Instead, he found a kitchen transformed. Not just physically, but in atmosphere. The tension that had permeated the air was gone, replaced by a tentative optimism. Thomas paused, taking in the changes. The repaired floors, the new equipment, the improved lighting. His eyes widened slightly as he noticed his station, now rebuilt to accommodate his height and featuring the brand of cleaning products he'd always preferred, but management had deemed too expensive. Several veteran staff members noticed his arrival and stopped what they were doing. A hush fell over the kitchen. Then Sophia stepped forward, her interim manager badge gleaming on her pressed shirt. "Welcome back, Thomas. We've missed you." One by one, staff members approached, offering handshakes, hugs, and words of welcome. The newer employees watched curiously as their colleagues greeted this dishwasher like a returning hero. Alexander stood back, allowing Thomas his moment. This wasn't about him or his redemption. It was about restoring the heart of Harbor Bistro, the recognition that every person who walked through those doors, whether to serve or be served, deserved dignity and respect. Thomas looked around the kitchen, then rolled up his sleeves. "Well," he said with quiet authority, "these dishes aren't going to wash themselves." And just like that, Harbor Bistro began to feel like home again. So, what would you do if you were Alexander Mercer? Would you have gone undercover to discover the truth? Or would you have trusted the reports from your management team? And how do you feel about Thomas Jefferson's loyalty being rewarded after 25 years of dedicated service? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed workplace injustice or perhaps been on the receiving end of it yourself? How did you handle the situation? If you enjoyed this true story of an undercover boss making things right, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring workplace stories. Don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss our new uploads. Check out these other videos appearing on your screen right now for more incredible stories of bosses who went undercover to transform their companies. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the most important changes happen when leaders aren't afraid to roll up their sleeves and see what's really going on in their businesses.